Hello and welcome to the RAF Museum Trenchard Lectures. I'm Dr Harry Rafal, and these lectures are ordinarily hosted at the Royal Aeronautical Society, and we hope to return to the Society in 2022 for our Trenchard Lectures. But for tonight's lecture, we have people joining us from around the world, from Brazil, Bhopal, and even Brighton. So wherever you're joining us from, hope you're very well. And it's truly a global audience for tonight's speaker, who's Dr Thomas Withington. And Tom has 20 years experience as a defence analyst and writer, specialising in electronic warfare, radar and military communications. Tom's thesis was supervised by Professor Peter Gray and examined the use of electronic warfare in air operations using Bomber Command's electronic warfare efforts against the Luftwaffe as a case study. Tom's thesis is actually a fantastic read. I really recommend it. He received a bursary from the Royal Air Force Historical Society, the Henry Probert bursary. And so it's a good opportunity for me to plug the Royal Air Force Historical Society. So I sit on its committee as an ex officio member. £18, you get free journals every year. That's 1, 2, free rather than them all being free. They come with your membership. It's outrageously good value. You can find how to join the society on the RAF Museum's website if you look for their journals. So do seek it out. But tonight, Tom will discuss how Bomber Command pioneered electronic warfare. Bring Tom onto the stage. Here we are. Tom, take it away.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Harry, thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. I'm delighted that you enjoyed my thesis, and I now realise that I owe you several beers the next time we meet. I can only echo your words regarding the RAF Historical Society. It is very good value indeed. The journals are absolutely superb. They're a good read. It's a great bunch of people. So if you're not already a member, I'd certainly recommend it. So without further ado, we're going to talk this evening about Bomber Command and electronic warfare. Now, I've chosen the title of this presentation as Torn Curtain. This is a reference to Alfred Hitchcock's 1966 masterpiece, which some of you may be familiar with. Those of you who perhaps don't know the movie, again, another recommendation. I'd certainly suggest you check it out. It's a great film. And this may sound like a bit of a cryptic reference, the Torn Curtain. What do we mean by that? Well, hopefully over the next few minutes, we'll get a bit of an idea of what I'm getting at with this rather strange reference. So, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about Bomber Command's 100 group and the birth of electronic warfare. But before we get into the specifics of what happened over 80 years ago, I'd like to take us all back 30 years or so to 1991, Operation Desert Storm, the showdown between a US-led coalition and the Iraqi armed forces and the Iraqi regime over the annexation of Kuwait in August 1990 by Iraq. And take us back there to have a think about something very important that happened during that conflict that owes its own experience to what Bomber Command did in the skies above Germany and occupied Europe. So, we are talking about a missile called Alarm. Alarm was the acronym for the British Aerospace Air-Launched Anti-Radiation Missile. Operation Desert Storm featured a number of new weapon systems deployed by the coalition, and one of these was Alarm. It had been several years in the making, but it had its combat debut in the skies above Iraq and Kuwait. It was deployed on board the Tornado GR-1s of the Royal Air Force. And the missile had a particularly important mission, which was to help protect those and other aircraft from Iraqi air defenses. Specifically, as its name suggested, it was designed to attack hostile radars. Now, how did it do this? Well, it was an ingenious system. It was mounted on the Tornado. It would be launched. It would climb up, I think, to about 40, 50,000 feet, maybe a little bit higher. Once at that altitude, it would deploy a parachute and it would look at the ground beneath it. It had a radar seeker mounted in the front of the missile, and this would listen for radar transmissions from the ground. As soon as it detected one of these transmissions, it would work out the most threatening radar. It would discharge the parachute, ignite a rocket motor, and fly directly towards that radar, detonate above it, probably destroy the antenna almost certainly, but probably destroy the rest of the radar as well. It was a particularly important weapon because the Iraqis had invested heavily in air defenses. They'd come out of an 8-year-long war with Iran, and during that time, they probably ended up with one of the most sophisticated, certainly one of the densest coverage of air defense in the world at that time. And what they were doing was they were deploying anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles around key targets like airfields to protect those. Those systems, the AAA, the SAM batteries, they will be linked to radars tasked with detecting targets and then guiding weapons, guiding ordnance, most importantly, towards those hostile aircraft. The RAF during that war was tasked with, amongst other things, hitting Iraqi airfields, and this required a particularly dangerous mission by which formation of tornadoes would have to fly straight and level, very low over the airfield to drop a runway denial weapon, which would hopefully crater that runway, destroy it, put it out of action, crucially, for the Iraqis. And this required running the gauntlet of these air defenses, protecting these airfields, and particularly those radars, protecting those airfields. So it became very important to suppress those as much as possible, and this was where alarm came in. Now, during that conflict, during Operation Desert Storm, some of you may remember that tragically the RAF lost 6 Tornado GR1s during that conflict to Iraqi air defenses, and I think I think that was the major cause. But I would assert that without alarm, the losses would have almost certainly been much higher. If you like, the Iraqi radars were the curtain protecting these strategic targets, and alarm was the missile that tore right through it. Here we have a particularly lovely picture of a tornado, RF tornado, and that wonderful desert camouflage that they had. And keen-eyed viewers will be able to see the 2 alarm rounds mounted on the ventral fuselage of that aircraft. So in many ways, alarm was the culmination of almost 50 years of RAF electronic warfare expertise that had been accrued up to that point. The need to tear through hostile air defenses had been learned by Bomber Command in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe during the Second World War. During that conflict, the command lit the torch that was later carried by the RAF's duo of the Tornado GR1 and Alarm, particularly the aircraft of 9 and 20 squadrons that were participating in Desert Storm. So how did we get here? How did we get to alarm and the techniques that the RAF pioneered for suppressing Iraqi air defenses? Well, it all started really right at the commencement of the Second World War. The first few years of that conflict were particularly difficult for Bomber Command. The reason they were so difficult was quite simply due to the loss rates. As the war unfolded, the loss rates suffered by Bomber Command increased. And these losses were a direct result of the sophistication of Luftwaffe air defenses. Germany had invested heavily in air defense from the 1930s onwards, particularly once Hitler takes power and the air defenses protecting Germany become more sophisticated, they become more dense, and this creates a real problem for Bomber Command. So just have a quick look at the figures. In 1940, the command loses almost 500 aircraft with over 20,000 sorties dispatched. That's a loss rate of 2.4%, thereabouts. 1941, things get worse. The command loses over 900 aircraft for over 30,000 sorties dispatched, and that's a 2.9% loss rate. And the trend just keeps going up. 42, 1,400 aircraft for over 35,000 sorties dispatched. This is a 3.9% loss rate. It's clear to see what the direction of travel is here. Things are not going to get better, they're only going to get worse. Arthur Harris becomes Air Officer Commanding of Bomber Command in February 1942. He is acutely cognizant of this, that the strategic air campaign can only really succeed if the Luftwaffe air defense is to be taken on. And he's cognizant of this fact, he realizes it, and he immediately sets about working to come up with ideas on how that can be done. Let's talk a little bit about Luftwaffe air defenses. As I'd mentioned earlier, from the 1930s onwards, the Luftwaffe had invested heavily in the defenses protecting Germany. And this included a number of specific aspects. It's obviously included the fighters, the fighter aircraft that were tasked with engaging hostile aircraft, also anti-aircraft artillery, better known as flak, of course, during that conflict, searchlights. These were all pressed in to help defend German airspace. But there were a number of other features that were in many ways seeing their debut during this particular war, and that was radar, and it was also the use of the en masse use of radio. So the Luftwaffe had their air defenses organized in a particular way, and it was a layered system. It really set the template for modern, what they call integrated air defense systems that we see around the world today that use pretty much all of these principles, including the air defense system that helps protect the UK and also other NATO members and other countries around the world. And how this layered system worked was there was effectively early warning radars that were positioned along the coastline of Western Europe. And of course, the number and the reach of these radars increased as Germany extended her territorial possessions as the war unfolded. And these radars were tasked with the initial detection of incoming Bomber Command aircraft as soon as possible after they left their bases in eastern England, bound for their targets in Germany and elsewhere. And the idea was to give the Luftwaffe as much notice as possible that enemy aircraft were incoming so that they could scramble their fighters, get their fighters into the air and be ready to engage those bombers. You also had ground-based air surveillance radars. Now, these were deployed behind the early warning radar chain, and these were used to track the bombers as they moved across occupied Europe. And again, the idea was to build up information here, to try and understand, anticipate where the targets might be, which direction are the bombers going in? Are they moving just due east? Are they moving northeast? Are they moving southeast, for instance? Where might they be heading? And that's what these radars were tasked with doing. And then you have fire control and ground controlled interception radars. These are particularly important systems because what they do is they effectively help control the intercept. Now, what Germany had done is it had parceled its air defense up into boxes of territory, and each box would control a specific swathe of German territory. They were organized in something known as the Kammhuber line initially. That was named after the general who came up with the concept for this. And in each of these boxes, you would have two of these radars. One would be tasked with detecting a Luftwaffe fighter and tracking it. The other would be tasked with detecting a bomber. And a ground controller would effectively use these radars to bring the fighter and the bomber together. In the early days, one of the radars would be tasked with actually directing a searchlight battery to get the searchlight to illuminate the bomber so it could be seen by the fighter, and the fighter then performs its interception. Alternatively, so it could be seen for the fire control of AAA, of flak, so that the bomber could be engaged from the ground. As the war goes on, searchlights are actually moved out of the Kammhuber line to protect key German targets, mainly cities. And so instead, these radars are used, as I mentioned, to bring these two things together, the fighter and the bomber. And all of this is controlled by a ground controller who would be responsible for that particular segment of territory. They will be sitting in a bunker on the ground, and they will be talking to the fighter and coordinating that interception. The fighters themselves also had radar, and this was necessary because most of the Bomber Command's operations were at night. Obviously, visibility is degraded with that, and therefore it's necessary for the fighter crew to have a radar through which they can pick up the bomber and actually get a very precise fix on where the bomber is and then perform their interception. Radio is also used for navigation. It's used in two ways, really. Firstly, you have radio beacons that fighters will loiter around like a cab rank. They will fly towards these beacons, and then once at these beacons, they will then be directed into these specific boxes to perform interceptions. Alternatively, radio navigation is also used to move fighters around Germany when raids are happening. So just to give you an example, let's suppose Bomber Command are attacking Frankfurt one evening, but you've got a large number of fighters in Bremen, or you've got aircraft elsewhere in Germany. Radio navigation is then used to direct these fighters towards Frankfurt to engage the bombers. And this may be done because perhaps there's defenses are particularly sparse around Frankfurt that evening. There's not as many fighters as there should be for whatever reason. And so that the radio navigation could be used to help augment these numbers and to move aircraft around the country at very short notice. And then finally, of course, you have radio communications, which are used by the ground controller to control the fighter, and also used by the fighter to explain to the ground controller what's going on, ensure they keep their situational awareness and keep everything moving during the interception. Now, the thing that all of these systems have in common, the radar and the radio, is they all need to use some form of radio transmission. Radar uses radio, just as the radios that we have at home, listen to the morning show, whatever it might be. So they're all dependent on this form of electromagnetic energy, radio waves. And very simply, if you can attack these radio waves, then you can degrade the radar, the radio communications, and the radio navigation. And in electronic warfare jargon, this is known as jamming, also slang for a bunch of musicians getting together, but in this case, a reference to actually using radio waves to attack other radio waves. Prior to 100 Group's activation in November 1943, the command has already taken the decision under Harris that it is going to engage Luftwaffe air defenses. As I'd mentioned earlier on, Harris was very concerned about the toll that these air defenses were exacting on his aircraft and aircrew. So there's two strands to this strategy. The first of which is a kinetic strand. In military jargon, kinetic refers to stuff that goes very fast, the stuff that goes bang, effectively. And key to this was the use of RAF fighters to engage their Luftwaffe counterparts, and also to use fighter bombers to attack fighter airfields and fighter infrastructure. And then you had electronic warfare, and this was the use of the jamming that I talked about just now to attack the radar, radio navigation, and the radio communication system that the Luftwaffe depended on. So just to talk a little bit about how the Luftwaffe fighter force was engaged. The RAF used a number of different tactics. These had the usual eccentric code names that were very much a hallmark of the RAF during the war. We'll see some more cool code names in a few moments, but you had Circus, Intruder, Ranger, and Ramrod. These are all variations on a theme, but all of them were designed to get the Luftwaffe to come to battle effectively. And so circus raids, for instance, you typically see 20 to 30 bombers flying over occupied Europe. They'd be escorted by up to 16 fighter squadrons usually. And what the idea was to force the Luftwaffe to respond to this, to scramble. Once the Luftwaffe fighter gets in the air, they get pounced on by RAF fighters, battle ensues. Then you had intruder raids. Now, this was the use of fighter bombers to go and beat up Luftwaffe airfields and fighters. They'd primarily hit the airfield. They'd try and hit aircraft on the ground. Occasionally, they'd also see fighters taking off and landing at their bases. They'd also have a crack at these too. Then you have Ranger. This doesn't really involve bombers so much, but this is a large number of fighters being sent over continental Europe. And again, trying to force the Luftwaffe fighters into battle, get them to take the bait, and then have a bit of a punch up in the sky. And then finally you had Ramrod. These are a bit like the circus operations, but they include an actual bomber attacks. This might be after quite a small target, but again, getting the Luftwaffe to respond, take the bait, and then do a bit of damage. On the electronic warfare side of things, the jamming really starts from 1941, and this commences with the use of electronic countermeasures. Now, electronic countermeasures, or ECMs as they're known in the jargon, these are effectively, they're very unexciting looking things. If you're somebody who's really into kind of cool, sexy looking aeroplanes, then I'm afraid electronic countermeasures are not the thing for you. They're boring, heavy black boxes that look like the sort of thing that control the back of your television or something like that. But in these box of tricks is where the dark magic all takes place. And what these will do is they will be configured to emit these radio waves to jam a particular Luftwaffe radio or radar system, as we will see. So they start to be introduced from 1941 onwards. And some of the notes, I won't go through them all because you've got actually quite a few, and some were more successful than others. But the main ones, I suppose the most famous ones in a way, we've got airborne and ground mandrel. This is an airborne system. So mandrel is the countermeasure, and it's producing an airborne configuration that can equip bombers. And then there's a ground configuration that can sit on very tall transmitters that are on the south coast and the east coast of England, and they can blast jamming out over the continent. And what mandrel did was it reduced the range of several German radar you had three distinct radars. You had Freya, Mammoth, and Wasserman, and these were all early warning radars and ground-based air surveillance radars. So those radars we talked about just now that are based on the coast, and then the ones that are based further inland to watch the bombers as they make their way across occupied Europe. We've got another system called Shiver, and this was aimed at jamming the Würzburg fire control and ground controlled interception radars. Now, you remember we talked about those radars in the box that would help with the final interception of the bomber by the fighter. Well, that's what Würzburg did. And Shiver was really a variation on the identification friend or foe system that was carried by all bombers. All RAF aircraft had this. In fact, this was sent out a radio code to RAF radars to let those radar operators know that it was a friendly aircraft, not send any Spitfires or Hurricanes up to go and do it any damage. So there was an adaptation of this, of the IFF Mark IV, I think it was the code named Shiver, and that was designed to jam Würzburg radars. Whether it was any good is a matter of debate. The jury's still out on that one 80 years later. Probably not necessarily as successful as some of the others, but a notable one. And then we've got tinsel, fittingly introduced in December 1942. This was aimed at jamming Luftwaffe high-frequency fighter radio. It's a brilliant system, very elegant in its simplicity. And what it would do is bombers equipped with a countermeasure, they'd have a microphone in one of their engine nacelles, of all places. And the radio operator, during a mission, they would scroll through, move their dial, wait until they heard a Luftwaffe radio channel. The minute they did, they would activate a switch and the microphone would pick up the engine noise and that would be blasted out across the radio channel. Of course, that can no longer be used anymore by Luftwaffe and they have to move to a new channel. So it constantly keeps them distracted, keeps them moving when they're trying to intercept the bombers. We've got another combined airborne and ground ECM called Grosser. This was aimed at Luftwaffe fighter radar. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about arguably the most famous electronic countermeasure of the war, which was nicknamed Window. Window was introduced, I think it was in July 1943 during Operation Tomorrow, which is the Allied bombing of Hamburg, northern Germany. And this was aimed at jamming the Würzburg radar we talked about just now. But it was, again, a bit like tinsel, it was an ingeniously simple idea and it used aluminium foil. So it used strips of aluminium foil and these were cut to about, I think, usually half or a quarter of the wavelength of the frequency of the radar's frequency they're intended to jam. And what you'd do is you'd have these things packed in massive bundles, and then during the main force operation on a particular night, the bomber crews actually physically throw these out of the aircraft. And what you'd end up doing is have millions of strips of aluminium foil that are in the atmosphere. And the magic really is what happens is the radar beams go out from the Würzburg radar and they hit these aluminium foil strips and they are returned back to the radar as a target, as a blip. Many of you will have seen on films, TV series, that kind of thing. Whenever you've got a radar, you've always got these little blips that kind of flicker on the screen, and that's the aircraft or the ship or whatever it is the radar operator is looking at. And what Window would do was cause millions of these blips or thousands of these blips to appear on the screen, and this would hide where the actual bomber is. I like to use the analogy of a snow globe. If any of you are familiar with snow globes, for those of you who it might just be a British thing, this, apologies if not, but it's effectively like a souvenir you often get at the seaside or tourist attractions, these kind of things. And it's like a sphere, plastic sphere. And there might be a model of something like the Eiffel Tower, for instance, and that's suspended in a liquid. And within this liquid are thousands or hundreds of little bits of glitter. And so you can see the Eiffel Tower quite clearly, but you shake the snow globe, and as soon as you do that, you've got all these bits of glitter everywhere, and it's harder to see your model of the Eiffel Tower. It's in there somewhere, but it's difficult to see. And that is precisely the effect that Window had on radar. And then you've got, just to quickly canter through a couple of others, you've got Cigar, again, housed on aircraft and on the ground. This jammed Luftwaffe VHF radio. This was actually a preemptive countermeasure because once tinsel was introduced, Bomber Command thought, hang on, once we start jamming HF, Germans are going to move their frequencies probably a bit further up the radio spectrum. We need to be ready for that. So they developed airborne and ground Cigar ready to jam VHF once Luftwaffe moved into that waveband for fighter communication, which they indeed did. And that meant Cigar was ready. And then finally, Surrey, we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. But this was primarily used on fighters, primarily on Mosquitoes. I think some Blenheims had it as well. And this was designed to detect Luftwaffe fighter radar transmissions. The reason being was that the RAF fighter would be up there, switch on Serrate, wait to get a transmission from a Luftwaffe radar. Serrate would give them the azimuth, the bearing of where that fighter is, and then the RAF fighter crew would have an idea where their target was, and off they go, ready to do the interception. Despite these ECMs being introduced, there were problems. The main one was workload. As you can imagine, if you're a bomber crew performing a very dangerous mission over Germany or elsewhere, you're already pretty busy and you're already pretty stressed, particularly when you're over your target. And the problem with ECMs is that these require the bomber crew often to operate these. So it's adding an extra burden to an already highly stressful situation. The other problem was that, to an extent, the electronic warfare efforts of Bomber Command were distinct and separate from the counter fighter work the RAF fighters were doing. And there was a need to bring these two things together in order to engage the Luftwaffe air defense in a holistic fashion. November 1943, the RAF activates 100 Group for precisely this purpose. This is Arthur Harris's idea that there needs to be a dedicated force, part of Bomber Command, that is tasked with the methodical destruction of German air defenses. And so we have the activation of 100 Group. For those of you, if I whet your appetite during this presentation, for those of you who would like to learn more about 100 Group, I can heartily recommend Martin Streetley's superb 1977 book called Confound and Destroy. Martin did the first major work on 100 Group, and it's still highly relevant. It's an absolutely brilliant read. If you can find a copy, grab yourself one, make a nice cup of tea, and find a comfy chair, because I promise you won't put it down. And then you might also want to check out Janine Harrington's work that she's done on 100 Group. I believe she's the secretary, or I think either secretary or president of the 100 Group Association. She's done 2 excellent books on 100 Group that you can find online. Also, I'd recommend those. They're equally a superb read. So 100 Group, as I said, activated November 1943, and it is tasked with engaging Luftwaffe air defenses holistically. This means it will go after the fighters and their airfields, but it will also tackle fighter radar, radio communications, radio navigation, early warning radar, ground-based air surveillance radar, and finally, fire control, ground control, interception radar. And to do this, it uses 3 distinct vectors. It uses fighters for the kinetic part side of things. It uses heavy jamming aircraft to do the airborne jamming component, and it uses ground-based electronic countermeasures. These are the giant transmitters located along the south coast of England, along the east coast, in order to also perform jamming that way. So it's got these 3 different techniques that it will use to try and engage German air defenses. Upon its activation, its main work of 100 Group is actually engaging Luftwaffe fighters. The chief assets that it has at its disposal are fighter squadrons, primarily Mosquitoes, and it uses the Serrate countermeasure we talked about just now. And this sort of dominates 100 Group's work from December 1943 up until the start of 1944, but it continues throughout the war to 1945, where it does its work engaging the Luftwaffe fighters. One of the problems with the Serrate mission was that fighters equipped with this particular electronic countermeasure could not actually escort the bomber stream directly. As I said just now, the bombers were actually using their own electronic countermeasures, and this caused some interference with the fighter radars in the Mosquitoes. So they had to work away from the main force, which obviously reduced the amount of direct protection that they could provide to that. And the night fighter situation is quite serious. Just to give you an idea of the kind of losses we're talking about, 24th, 25th of March 1944, nighttime attack on Berlin, 72 out of 110 bombers are shot down, and this is a loss rate of 9%. It scarcely gets any better a couple of nights later, night of 30th, 31st of March, Nuremberg is attacked, 96 bombers out of almost 800 are shot down, and that's a loss rate of around 12%. That being said, the Serrate fighter operation and 100 Group's fighter operations in general do have some successes, and they tally 236 kills of Luftwaffe fighters in the air and 21 destroyed on the ground by the time they finish their ops in April 1945. So they do make a difference. I've got a lovely picture here of Mosquito, and I think it's worth quoting 100 Group's review of operations directly. That summarizes that the Sarate operation was undoubtedly causing the enemy considerable trouble. Not only were fighters being shot down, but many others were being engaged in dogfights when they should have been attempting to intercept bombers. Let's get on to the heavy jamming aircraft. Now, these are my favorites, and effectively what we have here are standard bombers that were being used by the RAF that are tricked up. They are extensively modified to host a whole barrage of electronic countermeasures. I'll counter through these quickly. There's actually a host of different systems that they're using, but primarily the RAF was using the Lancaster Mark I. This was equipped with airborne Cigar. It also had the Fortress Mark I and Mark II and III rather, Halifax III and the Sterling III as well. And these had a number of countermeasures that we've not already talked about, including Jostle, that jammed Luftwaffe HF and VHF radio, and also Mandrel 3. That was an expansion of the original Mandrel system, in particular to go after the Wasserman radar along with Freya. Seconded to 100 Group are a couple of allied units. The Royal Australian Air Force, they bring their Halifax Mark IIIs, and also the US Army Air Force bring both B-17 Foxtrots and Golfs and B-24 Hotels and Juliets, and these are equipped with Carpet, Jostle, Mandrel and Windrow. And they served for most of the war, with most of the rest of the war with 100 Group, assisting Bomber Command and US Army Air Force operations. The heavy jamming aircraft are organized into what's known as a bomber support force, and this ramps up as the war goes on. It sort of reaches a crescendo, really, as we'll see towards the end of the conflict. But the first unit to join, first heavy jamming aircraft unit to join, is 101 Squadron, brings their Lancasters, and they're really there from the get-go from 1943. But things start to ramp up as 1944 unfolds. The US come in with 803 Squadron, bringing their Fortresses, and then in May 1944, we've got two more RAF units that join, 199 and 214. 199 brings their Sterlings. This is extensively equipped with Mandrel in various forms. 214 Squadron brings its Fortresses. They are initially equipped with ABC. They do get the airborne Grosser countermeasure from June, but this actually ends up as quite a disappointment, and it is discontinued after only 1 month of operation. Operation Overlord. This is, if you like, 100 Group's first opportunity to show what it's really made of. It's a very important contribution by the group, and it really sets the tone of how things are going to continue for the rest of the war. Now, many of you will know that shortly before Operation Overlord took place, the Allied invasion of Western Europe, there was a huge deception operation that was performed shortly before the amphibious and the airborne landings commenced. And this was on the back of a larger deception that had been going on for months and months beforehand to really try and fool the Germans into where the invasion was going to land. And 100 Group get well and truly stuck into this, and they do a number of cool things that does directly contribute to the eventual success of the landings. Now, we've got a number of units that are involved. 119, 199 and 803 squadrons perform Mandrel jamming, and they are doing this to reduce the range of these early warning and ground-based air surveillance radars that are located on the coast and also in the vicinity of the Normandy theatre where the invasion will fall. 214 Squadron also gets in on the act, and they work to jam Luftwaffe radio with their ABC electronic countermeasure, and Window is used extensively. Now, interestingly, it is used to create the illusion of a phantom fleet. Some of you may know that one of the ideas of the deception operation of Overlord was to try and convince the Germans that the main effort, the Allies' main effort, would actually fall at the Pas de Calais. After all, this is the shortest route between the United Kingdom and France. obviously occupied Europe at that time. So the idea was to convince the Germans that this is where all of the energy was going to fall. And how this was done was window was dropped in such a way as to simulate the radar returns, the radar echoes of a fleet that is moving at a steady speed, steady 3 to 4 knot speed across the Pas-de-Calais. And this was done with an epic feat of airmanship. There's actually a whole other presentation to be done on just how cool the window operation was during Operation Overlord, but we're limited with time today. Can't talk about that in too much detail, but there's plenty of stuff online, plenty of stuff in the literature about it. If you're interested, go and check it out because it's pretty cool. And then really all of these efforts provided a template for how 100 Group was going to do business for the rest of the war. I'd like to show you, this graphic sums up things very nicely. And it really gives an explanation as to how these various elements that 100 Group worked together to help contribute to the success of the invasion. So Glimmer and Taxable are the code names for the window operation. You can see there in the northeast corner of the map, just where Calais and Boulogne are, you can see that this was where the fleet, the simulation of this fleet moving across was taking place, with the aircraft dropping huge amounts of window. We've got ABC that is being used in the east, just south of Boulogne there, to jam the communications and protect the airborne operation that is sort of moving due south towards Fécamp and Le Havre. And then we've got Taxable, it's another window effort. And then on top of that, we've got these mandrel screens that are being flown just south of the Portland Bill and the south coast there, working to reduce the detection ranges of these coastal-based early warning radar, ground-based air surveillance radar, and the Normandy theatre of operations. So a lot of moving parts, a lot of things happening simultaneously, but it is a great success, and it gives 100 Group the confidence that they need to take things forward for the rest of the war. So back to the strategic air campaign, things continue to ramp up. 214 Squadron adds Jostle, Mandrel, and Window to its fortresses in July 1944. And then in August 1944, 1 month later, another heavy unit joins 100 Group, this time 223. They bring their Liberators, initially carry Jostle, but are festooned with more ECMs as their war continues. It's worth talking a little bit about some of the tactics that the heavies were using, these heavy jamming aircraft. You have the Special Window Force and the Mandrel Screen. And these worked in concert with each other, worked very, very closely. They're the kind of, if you like, the sort of Lennon and McCartney of airborne electronic warfare. And I'll explain a little bit about how they worked. So up until this point, the Luftwaffe got used to the fact that every time from 43 onwards, when Window's introduced, and 42 onwards, when Mandrel's introduced, every time the main force operates, it is using Mandrel and later Window. So it becomes socialized into realizing that Window, the use of Window, use of Mandrel means a main force attack is on the way. And 100 Group exploit this. What they do is they have their aircraft dropping large amounts of Window, and they have the other aircraft that are jamming, using the Mandrel screen to jam these radars based on the coast and the ground-based air surveillance radars. And the idea is, again, is you reduce the detection range of these radars and also jam with Window. But crucially, it's to convince the Luftwaffe that a raid is taking place. And again, this is going to force the Luftwaffe to scramble its fighters. And the Special Window Force and the Mandrel screen is pretty much used on every single night for the rest of the war, even nights when the main force isn't operating, because the idea is to always force the Luftwaffe to scramble. And by doing that, you cause attrition, you cause wear and tear on the fighters, you cause loss of fuel, obviously. You also cause a loss of morale. You're sending fighter crews up for no targets, effectively, or for a main force that isn't there. So again, it's this idea is progressive takedown in a holistic fashion of Luftwaffe air defenses. And it does pay dividends. I mean, occasionally the Luftwaffe just get bored. They don't take the bait. They just think, oh, okay, we're seeing Window, we're getting jammed again. Nothing's going to happen on this evening. And this does pay dividends for Bomber Command. Just to give you an idea, 17th, 18th August 1944, there's a huge Special Window Force Mandrel effort takes place in northern Germany. And then the next night, 18th, 19th of August, you have a main force raid on Bremen. This is largely unopposed. Luftwaffe don't come out to play. They're just like, you know what? It's not happening. They're spoofing us again. we're going to ignore it. So it has an important effect. Up until September 1944, the Special Window Force and the Mandrel Screen had been used away from the main force. As I'd mentioned, the main force continued to use some ECMs, it continued to use Window, it continues to use Mandrel on some of its aircraft. So the Mandrel Screen 100 groups efforts are sometimes used away from the main force while the main force goes and attacks its target. And again, the idea is to sort of divide Luftwaffe resources. The logic here being, you force the Luftwaffe to decide which is the main force operation and which is the spoof. They can't afford to ignore one, so they have to then divide their fighter resources in order to go and engage both. And this effectively takes some of the pressure off the main force. But from September 1944, they actually start to use Special Window Force and the Mandrel Screen to directly support the main force. And they also then work with the Serrate equipped fighters of 100 Group to then attack the fighter force as well. And they even bring in intruders to go and smash up the Luftwaffe airfield. So this is a true all-encompassing effort to have a crack at Luftwaffe air defenses in support of the main force on any given evening. And again, this is all about increasing the cost to the Luftwaffe. Harris knows that he cannot defeat Luftwaffe air defenses with the knockout blow. It's just going to be impossible. But he does realize that by doing this night after night, he is wearing them down, and this does pay dividends. So despite the war gradually starting to turn in the Allies' favour, this does not necessarily mean there is any let up in 100 Group's efforts. The electronic countermeasures keep on coming. New, cool, innovative systems arrive, primarily the result of people like the Telecommunications Research Establishment. They're based down in southwest England. They are the ones tasked with seeing what the Germans are doing in the electromagnetic spectrum, in radar and radio, and then coming up with the countermeasures that can defeat these. So we've got systems like Dyna 2 and Pipe Rack come in. This is aimed against Luftwaffe fighter radar, which is obviously a real worry. These are installed on 214 Squadron's Fortresses. That comes into service in October 1944. And then in November 1944, we have a really interesting use of Window. The Ruhr Valley is the industrial heartland of Germany in southern Germany, southwest Germany. It is heavily defended as a result. And what the Special Window Force does is it absolutely saturates the air over the Ruhr Valley with Window, and it effectively tries to create a huge amount of interference across the radars to ensure that the main force is left as undisturbed as possible. This is a particularly effective tactic. They realize that spoofing is going to be quite difficult in the Ruhr Valley just because of the level of defenses. So instead, the idea is, you know what, fill the area with Window. Let's see what happens. The Aussies rock up in January 1945, and they bring their Halifaxes with them. These are great aircraft. They only get a few months performing in support of 100 Group. They do a damn good effort, much as the Americans do. And then as the war is drawing to a close, the spoofing, the feints, the deception against Luftwaffe air defense just ramps up even further. In a particularly audacious night of operations in March 1945, the main force is tasked with attacking Berlin or Berlin, sorry, my German pronunciation not what it should be there, in eastern Germany. And in order to assist this operation, 3 other counterfeit operations, if you like, are planned. One bombs Kassel in central Germany, another attacks Halle in eastern Germany, and a third attacks Frankfurt in western Germany. And this forces the Luftwaffe to divide their resources fourfold. And obviously, I think it was, to quote, I might be quoting, I think I'm quoting Rommel, apologies if it's not Rommel's quotation, but I think it was him who said, if you try and defend everywhere at once, you're in reality defending nowhere. And this was really the logic behind what Bomber Command was trying to do to 100 Group and these feint operations. The Liberator is taken out of RAF 100 Group's service in April 1945, and it's replaced by the Fortress. Liberator fans will be, of which I am one, I do love the Liberator, but they will be disappointed to know that sadly its time with 100 Group was not always happy. One of its problems was it struggled to keep up with the main force. The Fortress, on the other hand, was an altogether more kind of hot hot and better ride at the end of the day. It was quicker and it could carry the weight of countermeasures, and it was a preferable aircraft. So 223 Squadron gets a lovely shiny Fortress B Mark II-3s that they then continue their war with. By April 1945, the Mandrel screen as we know it is largely discontinued. This is a result of the situation on the ground moving quite quickly, obviously, as the Allies advance into Germany proper. And this means that the actual extent of the coverage German air defences are able to provide over their own airspace is changing very quickly. And the utility of the Mandrel screen is a bit limited from that side of things. But with just a few days of the war in Europe left to go, 100 Group do not disappoint, and they finish with one large hurrah, one large hurrah, if you like, as the war's coming to a close. And they perform their largest operation of the war, involving 82 of their aircraft. And what they do is they absolutely bombard an area around Schleswig in northern Germany with Mandrel and Window as forces go to work on some of the holdouts there that are still resisting the Allies. So they go out of the bang, if you like. So conclusions. Well, what did 100 Group actually achieve with their electronic warfare efforts? Well, earlier on, I mentioned my presentation is entitled Torn Curtain. Here's the answer to this cryptic riddle. Well, the curtain was indeed torn. If you like, the curtain was the electromagnetic shroud that the Luftwaffe pulled across German airspace, pulled across occupied Europe, mainly through the use of radar, but also through the use of radio navigation, radio communications that helped them direct and command their fighters. And 100 Group, much like Alarm did in Desert Storm, was able to indicate that they could tear right through this and help the main force take the war directly to Germany. I think it's worth quoting this, again, returning to the 100 Group review of operations, quoting this in full. The success of the Window and Feint forces will perhaps be one of the outstanding features of the radio war. These forces, which so often stuck their neck far out and invited the enemy fighters to intercept them, achieved their object on many occasions. Great credit is due to those, the scapegoat forces of Bomber Command. From an operational point of view, 100 Group provided the template for holistic offensive counter-air operations that are now the hallmark of contemporary air warfare and will be in the future. NATO has a doctrine called offensive counter-air, OCA, and this is where air power is used to attack all elements of a hostile air defense system, whether that's fighters, whether that's ground-based air defenses, whether that's the industries, whatever is supporting them, all of those. This holistic approach to air defense suppression is known as OCA, and it was pioneered by 100 Group. Many of the tactics that 100 Group pioneered were also used extensively by the Israeli Air Force during Israel's wars in the Middle East in the 1960s and 70s and also in the 1980s. And then they used extensively by US-led coalitions in the Middle East, also by NATO in the Balkans and more recently in Libya. And they remain as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. The RAF continues to pour investment into its offensive counter-air capabilities. I'm sure Harry will be able to maybe share some information about some of the cool new stuff that Eurofighter is capable of, that the F-35 is capable of. We've got new systems coming in like Spear EW Jammer. That's an air-launched jammer that will equip the Typhoon and I think the Lightning. And I think Harris and his colleagues in 100 Group would recognize many of the things the RAF and the air forces, other air forces are doing today. They'll be impressed by the technology of it, but the principles will fundamentally be the same. However, I think I always like to save the most important slide for last when I'm talking about 100 Group, and here we are. And I hope this really provides an indication of actually what for me was the most important contribution 100 Group made during the war. And that is quite simply, it saved lives. It helped reduce aircraft losses and it helped reduce losses of aircrew. My great uncle was one of Bomber Command's aircrew during the war, and it was thanks to the efforts of 100 Group and other elements of the RAF that he was able to finish his tour of duty and live to a ripe old age. So just to look at the figures, we talked about the first few years of the war, how we saw those increase. In 1943, things scarcely get any better. We've got almost 65,000 sorties dispatched, 2,314 aircraft are lost, and that's a loss rate of 3.5%. As we mentioned earlier, 1943, 100 group is activated, it ramps up in 1944. Look what happens, it's tangible. We've got almost 150,000 sorties dispatched, and we lose 2,573 aircraft, and that is a loss rate of 1.7%. It's half of what was being experienced the year before. So 100 group are making a tangible difference. 1945, obviously we only have a few months of aerial warfare, only really about 5 months there, and by then we've got a similar kind of number of sorties dispatched that we saw in 1943, but the loss rate is now down to under 1%. So I think for me, that is 100 groups' most important contribution. Now, I'm cognizant I've been prattling on for a very long time. You've all been very, very patient. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave you with a still from Torn Curtain from said film. And I thank you all very much for your attention. And I'm very pleased to receive any questions. Thank you.
Well, it's a fantastic lecture, Tom. I'm gonna give you a chance to catch your breath before I put the many questions we have already received to you. But before I do, I'll just say to our audience, our next lecture is actually from the RAF Museum live with our archivist, Gary Haynes. He's going to discuss the controversy and cost of rhubarb sorties on the 25th of June. That's at midday on the 25th of Friday. But you can watch it live. We will be live streaming it, and of course the recording will be available on the same link. We'll have an online only lecture on the 8th of July, the same time, 6 p.m. as this one, and that's with Anna Fuhr, who's discussing desert flight in mandatory Iraq. There's some great lectures coming up. But Tom, I really enjoyed yours. I'm going to close your slides. Not that I don't enjoy the still from the film. Oh, I have to confess, I've never seen Torn Curtain.
Oh, you're in for a treat.
Yeah. But you know, I could quite happily spend the entire half an hour we have the questions, just plumbing the depths of your knowledge on this topic. I thought what came clearly through both for your lecture and your thesis is the work that had to be done to constantly evolve the countermeasures to keep ahead of the opposition. But we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to dive straight into those. And to our audience, do keep on putting them in for Ask Questions. You can vote up for questions you want to see answered as well. I'm going to try and get through as many as possible. So with that in mind, Tom, the first is, it's from Grayson Mice. How did the RAF's electronic warfare efforts interact with and compare to American US Army Air Force electronic warfare efforts during the same time period?
That's an excellent question. And really, in some ways, the US plays catch up. As we know, obviously the US comes into the war slightly later. But there's a huge amount of interest in the US into what the Brits are doing. And there starts being a lot of cross-fertilization between the two countries. In many ways, it's quite interesting because we're very familiar, obviously, with things like the collaboration on things like atomic weapons in the Manhattan Project, for instance, that the Brits were involved in. But the electronic warfare side of things, there's a lot that goes on with that. And actually, there's the late Alfred Price, a brilliant historian of RAF electronic warfare. He talks about this. His doctoral thesis was actually on US Army Air Force EW during World War II. And he does talk about the extent to which the Brits were influencing what was going on. In fact, I use the analogy of rock and roll, actually, which is going to sound a bit strange, but those of you, I'm sure many of you will know this, but of course, Britain gets rock and roll in the 1950s and everybody goes crazy and this is really cool. And then what we do, some Americans may disagree with me on this, but we invent pop music and we export it back to the United States. And of course, they then do all kinds of weird and wonderful things with it. And it was a bit like that with EW in a sense, because we shared a lot of our technology, but then the Americans would also add a spin on things. They would trick things up, they'd improve things, they'd see things perhaps we haven't done, and then say, hey, you Brits, look, we've done this, check it out, it's really cool. And we go and use that on our aircraft too. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization going on, and that set really important part, an important pattern for what would then happen later on in other areas.
Great. And this question from Alex Wood, he said, why is the jury still out on Shiver? Why was it less successful than the other jammers?
Good question, Alex. Thanks for that. Well, Shiva it's a strange one, and it comes back to actually an accident in a sense, where there was a myth built up around it by aircrew that if they switched on, this is early in the war, if they switched on their IFF system when they were over German territory, that this would somehow switch off searchlights, which sounds like the most bizarre thing. In a way, it is. But what it was that they believed that the searchlights were somehow radar or radio controlled, which they were correct on. They were radar controlled, and they thought by switching their IFF on, they caused some kind of interference, and the searchlights got switched off. Actually, what was probably happening was the searchlights were being switched off because the fighter had worked out where the bomber is, and not to dazzle the eyes of the fighter as it performs the interception. Reginald Jones, who is the sort of doyen, the Svengali, the genius, or one of the many geniuses actually, but the leading guy really behind electronic countermeasures, he gets very alarmed with what's happening with IFF, because the minute you switch it on, of course, you're sending out a radio signal, and that means Luftwaffe can detect you and think, there's a bomber there, we're going to go after them. And so so Shiva was an attempt to kind of formalize what the crew were doing with IFF, but I think they were eventually told not to use it anymore. But a lot of them, it's thought a lot of crews still did, as superstition built up that if we switch this thing off and on rapidly, we'll be safe. So that's why the jury's still out. I need to do a bit more digging into that. And of course, if anyone, other people might know the answer, and if they do, please let me know, because I'm very eager to find out.
Yeah, am I right in thinking that they discussed it and they were concerned that the morale of the crews might be affected by stopping them doing it completely?
Yeah, I think that's true. That was sort of one of the things I'd heard. I mean, it's like this apocryphal story you used to hear about Russian tanks, that apparently Soviet troops used to put things like railway sleepers and all kinds of stuff on their tanks, believing that, okay, if we've got that, you've got Panzerfaust fired at us, this will protect us. I mean, it probably didn't, but it made the crew feel at least something's there helping them. So yeah, I think there may be something to that.
Okay, now you commented on your German pronunciation, so I'm going to make you feel better by demonstrating how bad mine is. I just dropped down. Okay, so Drent J. Talenko, apologies if I've already mispronounced that, says, what role did the Luftwaffe's Funkauf-Klarungsdienst, roughly translated as the Electronic Intelligence Early Warning Service, play in the RAF Bomber Command's failure in the 1943-44 Berlin campaign?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm gonna have to plead ignorance on this one. I genuinely don't know. One of the things I found, one of the frustrations I had during my research, is I'm not a German. My German is pretty shocking, and this really restricted me to what the RAF were doing. But there is a huge amount of work to be done. If it hasn't been done already, it may have been, on how did the Luftwaffe actually respond to RAF electronic warfare? How did they work out what was going on? How did they deal with that? And how did they tactically adjust? So I must apologize for my ignorance on that. But again, if people have an idea, do let me know, because I'm eager to find out. So apologies.
I think it's a great question. You're right, lots of research to do in that area, so it'd be interesting to see what comes out in the future. Okay, so we've got a question from Spud, regular. It says, I remember reading back in the early 60s about 100 Group using German-speaking radio operators to give false information to the German night fighters. Did this really happen?
Spud, you've managed to hit upon one of my favorite topics of the war, actually. It did happen. It did indeed happen. Actually, a lot of the Polish crew members of Bomber Command had great fluency in German, some were even bilingual in German, and they were used to plant false radio traffic into the German Luftwaffe fighter communications nets during operations. So they would accompany, they'd work as radio operators on the Bomber Command aircraft. There's a wonderful story, it's actually in the 100 Group official history, where there's a transcript going on of a German fighter controller, their fighter, and this fake radio operator in a bomber. And actually, one of the things that's happening is at some point, the radio, the radop on the bomber starts saying, "Don't listen to this guy who's talking. He's an RAF plant. He's not your fighter controller. Listen to me." And the fighter controller's going, "It is me. You've got to pay attention to me." I go, "No, this is nonsense. I'm the person you're supposed to be listening to." So it was used a lot, and it was quite successful. But of course, what the ruse then was that the Germans decided to use female radio operators, knowing that Bomber Command wouldn't deploy female crew members on their bombers. So that, in a way, outflanked the advantage. But yes, it absolutely happened. And there's some very entertaining material on that that's out there.
Yeah, the phantom operators. There's I think it might be that one you're thinking of, where he starts swearing German. And,
correct. Yes, the Englishman is swearing.
Yeah. That's a really funny story. Okay. So who was in overall command of the RAF 100 bomber support group during its existence? Mike Hillier asks.
Mike, well, the head honcho of 100 group was one of my heroes of World War II, a guy called Air Commodore Edward Addison. And Addison's a really interesting guy. So he is an electrical, I think, engineer by training, trained in Paris at the École Supérieure d'Ingénierie Électronique, as I seem to remember. And he'd gone back to the UK during start of World War II, I think just before. And he ended up running 80 Wing. Now, 80 Wing was the unit that was tasked with attacking the German radio navigation beams that were being used by the Luftwaffe to bomb targets in the UK. You may have heard of things like Knickerbein, for instance. This was a navigation beacon that was designed to direct Luftwaffe bombers to their targets. So Addison is a real electronics whiz, and he's tasked with running 80 Wing, and he does it very well. And then when the decision is made to found 100 Group, he is the guy who's picked by Harris for the job. As I understand, I mean, him and Harris were good mates. They got on. I think I'm right in saying that Addison was godfather, I think, to Harris's kids, or maybe the other way around. It's one and two, but they have a really good partnership. I talked about the sort of special Windows force and the Mandrel screen being the Lennon and McCartney of electronic warfare. Well, Harris and Addison, in that case, were the Jagger and Richards of air defense suppression, because they both got it. And so Harris has got his vision of how to suppress Luftwaffe air defenses, but Addison is the guy who can come along and make his vision reality, and he does it very well. So again, another suggestion. There's a bit more material out there on Addison. He's a cool cat. Track him down, because he's had an interesting life.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Bill Strandberg, who asks, were the airborne linguists we've just been talking about, were they part of the 100 Group forces, or were they in a different part of the organisation?
I think the linguists were sort of seconded in from elsewhere in the command. I don't necessarily know that they were permanent members of the group. I think they were brought in when they were needed. I could be wrong, but that's my impression.
Okay. Now, Tad Diggle asks, this is a fantastic lecture. Thank you. Where can I pick up your thesis and research? And this is a great question. It is very good. We need to read it more.
That's very kind of you. I'm very flattered. I can heartily recommend it as a perfect insomnia cure if you are suffering any lack of sleep. You can find it on, I think it is on the University of Birmingham website. It is also on the British Library website in their archives there. However, if Harry, perhaps, I mean, you've got my particulars. Perhaps, is there some way of people contacting you, and then because I keep PDF copies, so I can always send that out to them if that would work.
I'll post the link directly into the chat at the end of our session. So if people want to pick it up, they can find the link either sort of 5 minutes afterwards or come back the next day. It'll be there.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, fantastic. Of course, they can follow you on Twitter. That's the way to do it.
They can.
Social media as well.
Yes, I'm a bit new to Twitter and things, but yeah, I'm trying to find my way through it. So yes, I'm always contactable that way as well.
Okay, so I'm going to try and make sure that we get questions as possible. So forgive me if I'm skipping questions if you've already had one asked. So Gary Connor says, were there dedicated US Army Air Force electronic warfare units, or were one or two airframes from each unit dedicated to the task?
Well, Gary, there's actually were dedicated units. I mean, 803 Squadron was one of them, and that's served with 100 Group, and I think there's another unit, might be 847. I have to look that up. But yeah, they were dedicated. The aircraft were converted to carry electronic countermeasures. They're proper jamming aircraft, and they had EW experts on board. I think the US Army Air Force's bomber fleet per se had electronic countermeasures fitted on the aircraft, but these were specific units. And in fact, there's an interesting bit of trivia here that in the people involved in electronic warfare are known as ravens. And the International EW Advocacy Organization, the Association of Old Crows, is a joke on the reference to ravens that these EW operatives had. Now, why were they called ravens? Well, part of the folklore is because these guys were a little bit mysterious. They did mysterious things with mysterious radio waves, and it was all very hush-hush and very secret. And they used to do things behind black curtains on the aircraft where they couldn't necessarily be seen. So there was a mystique, there was an air of intrigue about them. But yes, they were these dedicated units. And 803 Squadron actually based in a place called Cheddington in Hertfordshire, just north of London. So that was where their main operating base was in the UK.
The secrecy around radio operators is quite interesting. So ABC, everyone's cigar, the cigar operators, which is a fantastic description, they must have hated. We've got an interview from an air gunner who was on one of the squadrons. He mentions the operator, Herkovich, who's a quite interesting character himself, doesn't go into any more detail. And you think you can't be this sort of oblivious, and it does seem that it was sort of shrouded in sort of secrecy.
I think a lot of what it was that there was the secrecy. It sort of worked on a number of levels. There was the secrecy of the actual mission, but then also there was the science, and I think that sort of helped secrecy in a way because remember, radio was still quite a young invention at that time. It only really been towards the 19th century it started to emerge, and then it only really gets currency as a military capability in World War II. It is used in World War I, but as a mobile system, it gets currency in World War II. And radar is even younger. I mean, this is just a matter of years old. And so I think it's almost a bit like how the internet is for people like me now, where I could have somebody who's, let's say, a cyber warfare expert next to me, and they could explain to me all of the secret cool stuff they would do, and I could promise them I would not understand a single word of what they were saying. It would just be Greek to me completely. So I think that helped as well in preserving the secrecy, was that quite simply a lot of ordinary people, me including other experts, just simply wouldn't understand a lot of this technology. And again, if you're trying to understand it, if you're asking questions about it, well, that's going to raise a few eyebrows. What's this person doing? So I think the veil of secrecy works on a number of levels for that.
That's interesting. Okay, so we've got a question here. I can't see the name, so forgive me. With modern electronic warfare and electronic countermeasures, how would the arm handle spoof radar locations and sacrificial sites? For instance, a Toyota pickup with a pseudo radar emitter in the back.
Well, the spoof radars are an interesting area. I mean, the US Air Force, I think the US Army actually does deploy a radar spoof transmitter that it deploys near its Patriot batteries in order to kind of throw an anti-radiation missile off the scent. A lot of it depends on the sophistication of the missile. I mean, the American system AGM-88, the high-speed anti-radiation missile, which was used in Desert Storm lot, has a really good sophisticated radar seeker that can very accurately discriminate whether this is a genuine radar signal or whether it's a spoof. Other systems Russian, Chinese systems, I'm not sure what their sophistication is. But a lot of it really depends on how good your electronic intelligence is. And if you're an Air Force who is very good at regularly collecting ELINT, as they call it, keeping your libraries of radar transmissions up to date, then you can usually discriminate very well between a real radar and a counterfeit radar. There have been some things that have gone wrong. I mean, the Serbs got very good at using electromagnetic camouflage during Operation Allied Force. But then again, that didn't necessarily interfere with the anti-radar war too much. HARM was still a very potent weapon. There is a story of it does get spoofed once, and a HARM round misses its target and continues to sow fear, where it then lands in a suburban street and destroys a car and several roofs. Mercifully, nobody is killed, nobody is injured, but it can happen sometimes. And this is something that electronic warfare experts have to keep on top of, is making sure that they get as precise electronic intelligence as possible to avoid being spoofed in that fashion.
Okay, fantastic. We've got a question here. I think it's from Nick White. I'm going to try and find it again. Would you like to comment on Bomber Command's mission control or lack of it?
Well, Nick, the first few years of the war, Bomber Command, I think, are under instruction not to emit. Maintain radio silence at all times when over enemy territory. And this causes problems actually for the electronic warfare side of things, because these early countermeasures, they all emit. And one of the reasons, I mean, when I was kind of getting into this and getting excited about electronic countermeasures, one of the things I was thinking about, well, why didn't they do this earlier on in the war? I mean, they started to develop electronic countermeasures quite early, or there's certainly the thinking behind them. Why aren't they just used? And actually what it seems to happen is that there's this edict in Bomber Command that don't emit when you're over hostile territory. And of course, electronic countermeasures transmit, so they fall into this category. And this is the kind of emission control that you see. I don't know what happened in terms of bomber-to-bomber radios and things like that. I mean, that would obviously be a really good way of locating hostile aircraft. But from my understanding, it was a bit of a trade-off in a sense, because obviously the electronic countermeasures, they emit, they transmit. But and that potentially gave the Luftwaffe something to detect and home in on and realize where the bomber force was. But I think the calculation in Bomber Command is that the overall benefits that the ECMs would bring would outweigh that risk, and so it was still worth doing. So always, I mean, electronic warfare is like any other branch of combat, I suppose, in the sense there's always a trade-off. And I think that was the trade-off that had to be made, that the benefits would outweigh the disadvantages, and that then informed sort of the emission control lack of therein.
But I mean, they were quite poor early on in the war, not necessarily over enemy targets, but on the ground when they were tuning in radios. There seems to have been a lack of security in general in the RAF.
Yeah, it needed to improve on that score. Loose talk costs lives, as they say, and that's very true on the radio side of things.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Bill Strandberg asks if you can recommend a few books that capture the 100 group operations and crew experiences.
I can indeed, Bill. Give me 2 seconds. I've got some to show you. So if you've got a pen and paper handy, I will take you through the ones that I would thoroughly recommend. So Confound and Destroy, this was the one I talked about earlier, that Martin Streetley has written. It's quite an old book now, but it's still the kind of standard text. It's highly readable, and Martin's an absolute fountain of knowledge. So I've got it the wrong way around, I've just realized, have I? Oh no, maybe not. So there's this one. Something more recent, Janine Harrington's book, really. We've got, I think, Bill, you were mentioning about testimonies and accounts of individuals involved with 100 Group. I would suggest this. It's a bit of a weighty tome, but it's called RF 100 Group Kindred Spirits, and this is penned by Janine Harrington. I spoke about her a little bit earlier. She's secretary of the 100 Group Association, and this meaty tome, it runs to a total of it's over 500 pages. But don't let that be daunting to you, because in every page there's a fantastic story and account of what 100 Group were doing, not only for the people in the aeroplanes, but ground crew, people connected with the squadron, everything. So brew up a nice pot of tea, get yourself a bag of biscuits, get this comfy chair, and you won't be disappointed.
Okay, let's find another question. We're going to take one of the top ones anyway. So Alex Wood says, how did the Germans respond to our various new technologies, tactics, and did they develop any electronic countermeasures of their own?
Yeah, they did. I mean, electronic warfare has this kind of cat and mouse feel to it, that the enemy will, let's say, advance in radar, and so the other side will then advance electronic countermeasures in order to nullify whatever advantage that is. And yeah, the Luftwaffe do quite a bit. I mean, they adapt the freer radar to try and outflank the mandrel jamming, for instance, by altering its transmission pattern, doing some things with the physics of the radar. They're often trying to play catch up. we talked a little bit about earlier with what happened with tinsel, and then Grosser coming in as a way, I think it was Grosser or Cigar, I forget which one now, but as a way of outflanking the jamming that was being done on HF. So there's this constant sort of countermeasure. It's what's known in modern parlance, they call it electronic countermeasures. And these are typically things that radars or radios will have in order to kind of nullify whatever the jamming's doing or whatever effect that the electronic attack is having. And what that in World War II, that would often require actual hardware. So that you'd need to go and deal with valves and wiring and all of this stuff, or produce a new system. These days, this is software that does it, and that's the key thing. Software is the thing that will allow the countermeasure to be outflanked in a particular way. But yeah, this goes on throughout the war, and of course, each side is always scratching their heads of what have the RAF just done, and in a way, another reason why the introduction of countermeasures is delayed is because there's a fear of Bomber Command that they'll start a jamming war. That once they show their hand and show what they can do with electronic countermeasures, that the Germans will respond in kind and do the same to their own radar. So that's another reason, this sort of 2-year delay before they get their mojo and start using ECMs. So yeah, there's a lot. The cat and mouse game keeps going on.
Okay, so this question comes from John Lewis, never knowingly undervalued. Wasn't the same logic apparent in Red Shrimp and Red Steer and Balkans? I'm sure the logic perhaps on another part.
I'm really pleased someone's brought up the V-bomber ECMs here, because this is another subject dear to my heart. There was I think a similar logic, but I think one of the key differences was that in many ways the V-bombers were arguably designed for a one-way mission. So the logic of them was to get to a target in the Warsaw Pact in Russia, deliver a strategic nuclear weapon, and then after that, who knows? I'm friends with a guy who used to be on V-bombers, and you say, well, you almost left to our own devices. We didn't necessarily think there'd be much of a UK to return to, so maybe try and get somewhere else, somewhere relatively unaffected, land there and see what happens. So I think in many ways, a lot of the technology of those ECMs was derived from what Bomber Command were doing, but the tactics were slightly different. There wasn't this, for instance, Bomber Command with the V-Force, they didn't have a force designed to suppress Russian air defenses. The electronic warfare effort was for individual aircraft, just get them over the line, get them to their targets. And I think there's also an acceptance that only a proportion of the fleet would get through. Russian or Soviet air defenses were incredibly dense. And I think it was a sort of mass approach, get as many bombers up, get them blasting out as much noise as possible, and then hopefully some of those might get to their targets. So it's a good question, but as I say, I think the logic was slightly different in some ways.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one more question.
Cool.
I think it's I'm going to take Tad's question. It's in Korea and then in Vietnam, the US Air Force, started developing wild weasels. Was there any contribution from the RAF or the UK?
Tad, that's a very tantalizing question, and a superb one. Not to my knowledge, no. It's a bit. It's interesting with wild weasel because, in a sense, a bit like the RAF, the US Air Force had to relearn the lessons. It was actually the Navy. I mean, in Vietnam, it was the Navy who kind of embraced air defense suppression with these missions called Iron Hand, which used anti-radar, later used anti-radar weapons, initially used radar detectors mounted on aircraft to go and find SAM sites, then to attack these with gunfire and with bombs and rockets. So I think really for the US Air Force, what the Navy was doing in Vietnam was the key thing. You mentioned Korea. I mean, there was some defense suppression that was done in Korea, mainly involving fighter bombers and that kind of thing. But I think one of the things that really shaped Wild Weasel was the missile, the advent of the anti-radiation missile. That was the thing, because that then gave you the standoff distance, and it gave you an accuracy, and enabled you to an extent stay out of the threat envelope of the SAM system. The problem with air defense suppression in Vietnam and Korea before the advent of, I think was Standard, was the first anti-radiation missile. That was then followed by Shrike. I think I've got that right. And then finally in the 80s, HARM comes in. The problem before that was that you could go and beat up a surface-to-air missile emplacement, but you'd have to get within striking range of that particular emplacement. Of course, that becomes a very dangerous mission. I think it's one of the Wild Weasel crew members once who likened the actual mission to like a person biting a dog or biting a very angry dog. You imagine what the reaction. I certainly wouldn't recommend anyone tries that course of action with their dog or anyone else's for that matter, but it would give you an idea of how deadly that mission was. So I'm not aware of any cross-fertilization. And also, I think the other thing is that by the time the V bombers come in for the RAF in the 60s, the idea of the sort of en masse holistic suppression has been largely forgotten. They don't really pick that up again until Desert Storm. Maybe in the Falklands there's a bit as well. So yeah, ideally both sides should have talked to each other. It doesn't seem that they have done though. So, but great question, Tad. Thanks for that. Okay,
fantastic. Well, I think all that's really left is to thank you, Tom, for an amazing lecture. Very informative.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to post for everyone who's watching. I'm going to post the link to your thesis into the comments, so they'll be able to read in detail the knowledge that has gone into this talk, because it is astoundingly in depth. But yes, thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Han, thank you so much. Thank you for organising this. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone for the questions and for everyone who tuned in. Hope to see you again.
Okay, brilliant. And thank you very much to everyone who's joined us, no matter where you are. For me, I'm off for a beer, well earned. But wherever you are, whatever you're drinking, have a good night.
Ciao.